Hello, everyone. My name is Richard Simpson, and I'm here with I'm a student editorial member on the board of the Journal for Sports Psychology in Action. I'm here with my fellow student editorial member, Sarah Saxton, and we're very fortunate today to be joined by the editor of the Journal in Sports Psychology in Action, Professor Rob Schinke. A lot more titles to mention than we have time for within this introduction. But today, we're very fortunate to be joined by Rob to have a back and forth conversation, to learn a little bit more about the Journal in Sports Psychology in Action today, and to provide a bit more context and information for those looking to submit to the journal, and also to those of you who are part of the wider readership who want to get to know a little bit more about why you should read our journal. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Sarah to get started with the first question to pitch to Rob. Welcome, Rob, as well. Thank you so much for giving your time today.
Thank you very much.
So our first question, just generally, what are the purposes and aims of JSPA?
The Journal of Sports Psychology in Action is a really original peer-reviewed journal as compared to a lot of the other well-established journals that are twice the length, and they're very empirically driven. The Journal of Sports Psychology in Action is meant to take that scientific theoretical element and then transfer it into and parlay it into practice with practitioners. So it in a sense is a conduit between science and knowing of and knowing. So we've sort of set up a journal here where it's intended for a readership that is not only academicians, but it's practitioners, it's coaches, it's athletes, and it's potential consumers.
Fantastic. And that leads us really nicely onto our next question. When we think about the journal's target audience and we think about who we want this to reach to and really have an impact on, you named obviously some parts there, but for you, who comes to mind first when you think about our target audience of the journal?
Well, I think often in this domain, the domain has been bifurcated, meaning there's been academicians siloed in one realm, and then there's been practitioners siloed in another, and sometimes the two dialogue. This particular journal is meant as a bridging process across those people and across coaches and athletes, so people could actually engage in a meaningful dialogue in a manuscript that is much shorter, much crisper, clearer, accessible to the readership. And so the consumer is very much anyone who would be interested in sports psychology, sport and exercise psychology, and written not at a level, but in a manner where it's not opaque, regardless of what your background is, whether it's a grade 12 student interested in sports psychology, an undergraduate student, a doctoral student, an academician, an athlete, a coach, someone from the media. It really will not make a difference. It's meant to demystify the domain and condense it and crystallize it.
I think especially considering that we're both, practitioners in the field, both doctoral students, it was important for us to know a little bit more about what topics in sports psychology are of particular value to the journal. And maybe are there any topics that aren't as suitable for the journal?
We're very open in terms of topics and becoming progressively more so. So we're talking about sports psychology, we're talking about exercise psychology, we're talking about performance psychology, we're talking about dance, we're talking about holistic well-being. However, the idea should be to some degree linked to sport and exercise psychology scholarship. So obviously you go to the reference section of a typical journal article and there's 6 or 8 pages of length to it, and whereas in this particular journal it's 1 to 2 pages condensed. But the vast number of topics, we've had one contribution, a really interesting one from the United Kingdom on policing and performance, and yet a lot of the tenets of sports psychology were used in an intervention with policing. So we're fairly open, but it has to be relevant to our practitioners and to our consumers tied to our field.
Yeah, that's really fantastic. And I think what our viewers tuning in today would be really intrigued. Of course, you've got a rich background of working for a range of journals, editing, and and guiding journals in terms of the impact factor and so on and so forth. To you, obviously, as the editor of the Journal of Sports Psychology in Action, what's a unique selling point about this journal? What is so different about this journal for you from other peer-reviewed journals that you may have worked with previously?
Yeah, and a lot of the peer-reviewed journals that I've worked with, I've guest edited almost all journals, and I've been an associate editor with many of the higher impact factor journals. I'm now also the co-editor of the International Journal of Sport and Exercise Psychology, soon to be the senior co-editor of that journal. Those journals are typically of a length of 7,500 to 9,000 word contributions. Some of them pare down to 6,500 words, meaning about 25 to 35 pages of length, and then tables and figures and what have you. With this particular journal, the manuscripts are meant to be condensed into 15 or 17 pages. I permit 15 to 17 pages as opposed to your prototypical 10 or 12. However, in those manuscripts, when I'm leafing through it, even after the associate editors render their decisions, I want to see half of the manuscript at most devoted to the theory and the research, and at least a minimum of half of that manuscript devoted to its parlance into practice. Now, there are people who are submitting without looking at the submission guidelines and doing an entire empirical piece of research with no applied relevance or a paragraph of applied relevance. Those sorts of manuscripts belong elsewhere. This journal is a minimum of half of the manuscript devoted to, okay, what do I do with this theory, or what do I do with this research in the real world of a context such as boxing, such as any form of Olympic sport, professional sport, performing art, and what have you. So it's an interventionist piece. Now, an interventionist piece in and of itself without research would also not make the threshold. So it's that fine balance between theory, evidence basis, and practice.
That was a great segue into our next question. I'm glad you brought up submission, because that's a lot of the remainder of the questions that we have. So what do you look for in a JSPA manuscript in addition to all the things you just discussed? And then what are some of the standout features of a strong submission?
Yeah, a standout feature of a strong submission is that it's undertaken by an author, and the author is meant to be a practitioner, and the practitioner has a background, and that background contextualizes the reason why the piece is contributing to knowledge and contributing to the understanding of the reader. Now, oftentimes you have contributions that don't really tie in who the practitioner is, what their perspective is, the reason why they've chosen a given intervention. And interventions are always context-driven if they're done correctly. So it's obviously having a theoretical background and an evidence-based background, but that evidence is not devoid of context. Every practitioner knows you step into a performance environment, and that performance environment has a subculture, has needs, has challenges based on its current status, the status of the sports system or physical activity, whether we're in COVID. All of these sorts of environmental factors contribute to the environment where the practitioner is gathering their data or developing their intervention. And so it's evidence-based in situ, as opposed to something that's relevant across all contexts. So I ask the authors to oftentimes situate, in fact, I expect them to situate their background, why that background, not only their personal one, but their background in practice and practicing in that context, are driving this particular contribution. The contribution itself has to be part about the practitioner's needs, the consumer's needs, and how these roll out into the intervention. So it's sequential, and you could actually follow the reasoning as to why the intervention is being done, how it benefits the clients, why the interventionist is choosing the decisions they have, why they have their expertise in that area. And so it demystifies the domain of sports psychology.
Mm. No, absolutely. And I think what we've outlined so far is we've outlined kind of some common mistakes in some ways, or some things that we don't necessarily want to see in the journal. Would be like, for people who might be looking to submit to the journal, are there any other kind of common mistakes you might often see within submitted manuscripts to the Journal of Sports Psychology in Action that might be useful for our listeners to be mindful of when they're preparing a submission?
More generally, one of the things that people commit to as a mistake across journals is they don't read the submission guidelines and the mission of the journal. And that's across journals, whether it's this journal or any other journal. They don't take a look at the submission guidelines. They don't take a look at the purpose and the interest, the relevance of applied practice, more or less relevant to the journal. In relation to this particular journal, I've received some manuscripts that are entirely interventionist without basis. I've received, at the other end of the continuum, research articles that are 30 pages long with maybe a paragraph or not even a paragraph devoted to intervention. And those manuscripts are typically sent back to the author unsubmitted, and the author is required to recast the manuscript into a way that is congruent with the mission of the journal. Now, the topics will vary, going back to Sarah's previous question, in terms of what's permissible in this journal, a broad base of topics reflecting an ever-widening domain. However, the mission of the journal is always evidence-based practice, and the practice is equal to the evidence basis. So the weight of those two pieces in relation to a much shorter manuscript, easier to write in some regards than a 30 to 35 page manuscript, such as what I would see in the other journal where I co-edit. On the other hand, people really have to engage with their theory and their research and think, okay, how am I actually taking this this knowledge for knowledge's sake and transferring it to a consumer as a form of intervention, and going that next step of concretizing the knowing of and the theory into the practice and the knowing firsthand of how to use it.
What are some of your biggest tips for authors who are engaging with the review process?
Yeah, the review process is very interesting with this journal. You have the reviewers weighing in, you have the associate editor weighing in, and at the end of each manuscript, before the decision is rendered, you have me weighing in and taking a look at those levels of evaluation. I think one of the things that an author should keep in mind is that the reviewer feedback in this journal is oriented towards the mission of the journal. So you could have a wonderful contribution empirically and not have sufficient balance in terms of the intervention, and you may receive those sorts of elements of feedback. You may also have from reviewers or from the associate editor or from me a lack of contextualization in the contribution. What we're trying to do is to coach you towards having a manuscript that anyone could take a look at, understand, potentially apply in their context, be they an emerging practitioner such as yourselves or an established practitioner such as myself, who's been in the field for too long, 25 years. And it's completely consistent across the reviewers, the associate editor, and the editor. Now, I weigh in at the end to ensure that that consistency exists and that the feedback is congruent with the mission of the journal, and that every piece, a Journal of Sports Psychology in Action accepted manuscript, has certain qualities that are consistent. It's the golden thread across all accepted manuscripts. Now, a manuscript submitted to this journal might not be acceptable in other journals, and the manuscript submitted elsewhere would certainly not, in and of their format submitted elsewhere, be accepted into this journal. But I think one of the key elements to keep in mind in your submissions and in the review process is that fine balance, that beautiful balance between knowing of, knowing, and applying, and making it transparent what that continuous process is to the rollout of an intervention.
Thank you so much for that response there, Rob. I think what would be really interested, I know definitely a lot of readers and also a lot of kind of potential submitters would be interested in, is if there'd be any plans or any potential special issues that might be coming up that or might be in the works that might be of interest to the wider readership, and then also people who might align to the work.
Yeah, in 2022, we had a call for professional sport and organizational sports psychology in professional sport domains. And Charlie Mayer has guest edited it, and it will be out in the 4th installment of 2023. All of those manuscripts are completing the review process and going forward. And so you'll see them before Christmas of this year. In 2024, you will have a special issue. You'll see a special issue co-edited by Natalia Stambolova from University of Halmstad in Sweden, and Samuel Roy from Israel. He works with Team Israel, and they are doing a whole section on career transitions. We are open actually for 2025 for ideas from the readership and from yourselves as the student members, and from the associate editors and the editorial board, for new emerging topics that would be most interesting and are at the ahead of the curve in terms of intervention, science to practice intervention. So we are looking for new special issues all the time.
Great. This has been super helpful for me, even as a student rep for JSPA. So thank you again for all your responses. I will wrap it up with, beyond this video, obviously, where can I go for additional guidance on submitting to JSPA?
Yeah, and you can go to the journal. You can always email me at rschinke@laurentin.ca, and I'll obviously respond to your email in a fairly prompt manner. And I look forward to engaging with anyone interested in this journal at any time.
Thank you very much for your time, Rob.
You're most welcome, and thank you for those wonderful questions.